I used to think my life was perfect, or at least as close to perfect as life could be. I had a comfortable home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a kind and dependable husband, and no pressing worries to keep me up at night. But comfortable can often blur into predictable, and predictable can sometimes feel like a slow fade into irrelevance. Peter, my husband of 7 years, was everything a woman could ask for, or so I told myself. He worked tirelessly to provide for us, always punctual, always reliable. But that reliability often felt like distance. Over time, our conversations became shorter, our shared moments rarer. And then one day, as if to prove he was still paying attention, Peter surprised me with an announcement over dinner. "I've hired a personal trainer for you," he said, cutting into his steak. I blinked at him, unsure if I'd heard correctly. "A trainer? For me?" He nodded, his tone casual. "I thought it might help you feel better. You've been complaining about feeling stiff lately, and, well, a little flexibility wouldn't hurt." There it was, his polite way of pointing out that I'd let myself go. I wasn't oblivious. I'd gained a few pounds over the years, and my yoga mat had been gathering dust in the closet. But to hear it from him stung in a way I didn't expect. "Peter, I'm not sure I need a trainer," I said, forcing a smile. "Trust me, you'll love it," he replied, brushing off my protest. "His name is Jake. He's got great reviews and seemed professional when I spoke to him. He'll come by 3 times a week." And just like that, the decision was made. The first time Jake arrived, I was still in denial about the whole thing. I greeted him at the door wearing baggy sweatpants and an old t-shirt, determined to make it clear that this was Peter's idea, not mine. Jake, however, was hard to dismiss. He had an easy confidence about him, a broad smile, sun-kissed skin, and a physique that seemed sculpted from stone. His dark hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, and his voice carried a warmth that immediately put me at ease. "You must be Evans," he said, extending a hand. "It's great to meet you." "Hi," I replied, shaking his hand reluctantly. His grip was firm, his palms slightly calloused. Jake wasted no time. He set up a small area in the living room with mats and resistance bands, explaining the basics of his approach. He spoke with enthusiasm, but I barely heard him. My mind was stuck on Peter's reasoning for hiring him. Was I really so out of shape that I needed this? The first session was grueling. Jake was patient but firm, pushing me to stretch muscles I hadn't used in years. I felt awkward and self-conscious under his watchful eye, but he never made me feel inadequate. "You're doing great," he said after I managed a particularly clumsy attempt at a plank. "Consistency is key. You'll get the hang of it." I wanted to scoff, but his encouragement was oddly reassuring. By the third session, something began to shift. Jake had a way of making the workouts feel less like a chore and more like a shared goal. He was attentive, adjusting my posture with gentle hands, his touch lingering just long enough to send an unexpected thrill through me. I told myself it was nothing but a harmless reaction to a stranger's presence in my otherwise uneventful days. But I couldn't deny the growing anticipation I felt every time I saw his car pull into the driveway. Peter, of course, was oblivious. He'd leave for work before Jake arrived and return well after our sessions ended. I don't think it ever occurred to him that Jake's visits could be anything other than professional. One afternoon, as we finished a particularly challenging session, Jake sat down on the mat beside me. "You're improving fast," he said, his voice laced with genuine pride. "Thanks," I replied, wiping sweat from my forehead. "I guess it's not as terrible as I thought it would be." He laughed, a deep, warm sound that made me smile despite myself. "See? Told you it wouldn't kill you." For a moment, we sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Then Jake turned to me, his expression more serious. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." Why do you think Peter hired me? I mean, I know what he told me, but I'm curious what you think. The question caught me off guard. I am not sure, I admitted. He said it was to help me feel better. But sometimes I think it's more about how I look. Maybe he's not as happy with me as he used to be. Jake frowned. That doesn't sound right. You're beautiful, Evans. Anyone with eyes can see that. My breath caught in my throat. The words were simple, but the way he said them made my heart race. I looked away, unsure how to respond. Sorry, Jake said quickly. I didn't mean to overstep. No, it's okay, I murmured, my cheeks burning. The moment passed, but the weight of his words lingered long after he left. That night, I lay in bed next to Peter, unable to sleep. His breathing was slow and steady, his face peaceful in the dim light. I wanted to wake him, to tell him how I felt, about him, about myself, about Jake. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't dare admit to anyone, least of all myself. Something was changing, and I couldn't stop it. I told myself it was harmless, that the flutter in my chest when Jake smiled was just a silly crush. After all, I was a grown woman, a married woman. But with every session, the line between innocent admiration and something darker grew harder to see. Jake's presence was intoxicating. He carried himself with a confidence that was both disarming and magnetic. His compliments felt genuine, his attention undivided. Unlike Peter, who often seemed preoccupied or tired, Jake made me feel seen. It happened one evening when Peter was away on a business trip. The house felt too quiet without him, and I found myself looking forward to my session with Jake more than I wanted to admit. He arrived right on time, as usual, but there was a different energy between us that day. His smile lingered a little longer, his touches during stretches a little softer. Ready to work hard today? He asked, his voice warm and inviting. I nodded, though my heart was already racing. We began with stretches, Jake guiding my movements with his hands. I tried to focus on the exercises, but his proximity made it impossible to think straight. The air between us felt charged, and I could sense he felt it too. As we moved into more challenging poses, Jake knelt beside me to correct my posture. His hand brushed against my back, and I shivered at the contact. Relax, he said softly, his breath warm against my ear. You're too tense. I'm trying, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He placed his hands on my shoulders, pressing gently to guide me into the stretch. His touch was firm yet tender, and I felt a surge of heat rush through me. There you go, he said, his tone low and soothing. That's perfect. I stayed in the pose, but my mind was far from the workout. All I could think about was the way his hands felt on my skin, the way his voice seemed to wrap around me like a cocoon. When the session ended, I offered Jake a glass of water. It was a small gesture, but one that felt strangely intimate. Thanks, he said, taking the glass from me. Our fingers brushed briefly, and I felt a jolt of electricity. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the tension. You must think I'm terrible at this whole fitness thing. Not at all, he replied, his gaze steady. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. I looked down, unable to meet his eyes. You're kind to say that. It's the truth, he said, stepping closer. You're amazing, Evans. You just don't see it. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I looked up at him, and he kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands clutching his shirt as the kiss deepened. For a moment, the world disappeared. There was no Peter, no guilt, no consequences, only the heat of Jake's lips and the rush of desire flooding through me. When we finally broke apart, I stepped back, my heart pounding. I'm sorry, I stammered, my face burning. I shouldn't have. Evans, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. You don't have to apologize. But I'm married, I whispered, the reality of what just happened crashing down on me. I know, he said, his expression conflicted. I know this isn't right. But I can't help how I feel about you. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I couldn't help how I felt either. That night, after Jake left, I sat in the living room staring at the darkened television screen. My mind replayed the kiss over and over, each time making my stomach twist with a mixture of guilt and longing. When Peter called to check in, I felt like a fraud. Everything okay? He asked, his voice calm and familiar. Yeah, I replied, forcing a smile he couldn't see. Everything's fine. But everything was far from fine. Over the next few sessions, Jake and I tried to act as if nothing had happened. We kept our interactions professional, our conversations light. But the tension between us was palpable, an invisible thread pulling us closer despite our best efforts to resist. One afternoon, as we finished a session, Jake hesitated before leaving. Evans, he said, his voice low. I don't want to make things harder for you. If you want me to stop coming, I'll understand. I looked at him, my chest tight. The thought of not seeing him again felt unbearable, but I knew continuing down this path would only lead to more pain. I don't know what I want, I admitted, my voice trembling. He stepped closer, his expression gentle. I don't want to hurt you. But I also can't pretend I don't care about you. His words broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I reached for him. That night, we crossed the line we'd been dancing around for weeks. It was reckless and selfish, a moment of raw emotion that defied all logic. Afterward, as we lay in the quiet of the living room, reality began to sink in. What are we doing? I whispered, more to myself than to him. Jake didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. I don't know, he admitted. But I don't regret it. I closed my eyes, torn between the warmth of his presence and the cold truth of my betrayal. As the days passed, the weight of what I'd done grew heavier. I avoided Peter's gaze, afraid he'd see the guilt written all over my face. But despite the shame, I couldn't bring myself to end things with Jake. The connection we shared was unlike anything I'd felt in years, and it scared me how much I craved it. There's a strange duality in living a double life. On the surface, everything seems the same. The same routines, the same conversations, the same smile plastered on your face. But underneath, there's chaos, a constant churn of guilt, excitement, and dread that never lets you rest. That's what my days had become. Mornings with Peter were the hardest. He'd kiss me goodbye on his way to work, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I'd force a smile, wave him off, and then spend the rest of the day trying to quiet the voice in my head screaming, "What are you doing?" But when Jake came over, all of that melted away. He made me feel alive, like I was more than just a housewife, more than Peter's dutiful partner. With Jake, I felt seen. And I hated myself for needing that so much. The affair quickly took on a life of its own. What started as stolen moments after our sessions became longer, more intimate. Jake would linger after workouts, sitting on the couch with me, sharing stories about his life. He talked about growing up in a small town, his dreams of opening his own gym, and the heartbreaks that had shaped him. "You deserve someone who makes you happy," he said one afternoon, his eyes locked on mine. "I have that," I replied, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Jake shook his head. "Do you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Peter began noticing small changes in me. At first, it was subtle. "You've been smiling more lately," he said one evening as we sat down for dinner. "Have I?" I replied, feigning ignorance. He nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. "I guess the workouts are working. You seem lighter." I forced a laugh, my stomach twisting. "Maybe." His words should have been a relief, proof that he wasn't suspicious. But instead, they felt like a dagger to the chest. He thought I was happier because of him, because of the life we'd built together. And I was using that belief to hide the truth. One evening, after Peter had gone to bed, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There was one from our honeymoon, a candid shot of Peter laughing as we stood on a beach, the sun setting behind us. I stared at the picture for a long time, tears blurring my vision. I loved Peter. I knew that. But the love we shared felt buried under years of routine and unspoken frustrations. When had we stopped trying? When had I started looking elsewhere for the things I should have found in him? The questions haunted me, but I had no answers. Jake, on the other hand, was a constant temptation. He'd text me late at night, his messages laced with humor and flirtation that made my heart race. One night, after Peter had fallen asleep, I couldn't resist replying. "Jake, can't stop thinking about you." "Me, you shouldn't say things like that." "Jake, why not?" "It's the truth." "Me, because it makes this harder." "Jake, I don't want to make it harder. I just want you to know how I feel." I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to end it, to tell him we couldn't keep doing this. But another part, the part that craved the way he made me feel, I couldn't let go. The lies started to pile up. Work ran late, I told Peter when he asked why I hadn't answered his call. I met an old friend for coffee, I said when he questioned why I was gone longer than usual after my workouts. Each lie felt like a brick added to the wall between us. And yet, I couldn't stop building it. One afternoon, while Peter was at work, Jake and I sat on the couch, our bodies close enough to touch but not quite crossing that line. "I don't want to hurt you," Jake said, his voice soft. "Or your husband." I looked at him, my chest tight. "Then why are we doing this?" "Because I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his eyes filled with longing. "And I don't think you can stop thinking about me either." He was right. And that terrified me. The fear of discovery was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Every time Peter came home, I braced myself for the possibility that he'd found out. But he didn't. Instead, he remained blissfully unaware, his trust in me unwavering. "I'm proud of you," he said one night as we got ready for bed. "You've been working so hard on yourself. It shows." I smiled weakly, my heart breaking. "Thanks." He kissed my forehead, his touch tender. "I love you, Evans." "I love you too," I whispered, the words heavy with guilt. The turning point came on a Saturday afternoon. Peter had planned a surprise date for us, a rare gesture that should have made me happy. But instead, it filled me with dread. As we sat across from each other at a cozy restaurant downtown, he reached for my hand. "You know, I've been thinking," he said, his voice warm. "Maybe we should go on a trip. Just the two of us. It's been a while since we've had time together." "That sounds nice," I replied, though my mind was elsewhere. Peter smiled, his eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Good. I'll start planning something." I nodded, forcing a smile. But inside, I felt like I was suffocating. When Jake texted me that evening, I didn't reply. For the first time, the weight of what I was doing felt unbearable. I couldn't keep living like this, torn between the life I'd built with Peter and the feelings Jake had awakened in me. Something had to give. By the time Sunday morning rolled around, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff. The guilt that had been simmering for weeks was now boiling over, threatening to consume me. Peter was in the kitchen making coffee, humming to himself like he didn't have a care in the world. I watched him from the doorway, my chest tight. He didn't deserve this. "Morning," he said, glancing up with a smile. "Coffee?" I nodded, stepping into the room. "Sure." Peter poured me a cup, setting it on the counter before leaning against the fridge. "You seem quiet. Everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He studied me for a moment, concern flickering in his eyes. "Maybe you should take it easy today. You've been pushing yourself a lot lately." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat growing. "Yeah. Maybe." Later that afternoon, Jake texted me. "Jake, can I see you today?" I stared at the message, my hands trembling. I knew I should say no, that meeting him would only make things worse. But part of me still clung to the idea that I could fix this, that I could find some way to reconcile the life I had with the feelings I couldn't ignore. Come by at 3. Peter will be out." The moment I sent the message, I regretted it. But it was too late to take it back. When Jake arrived, I opened the door and stepped aside to let him in. He looked as conflicted as I felt, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet hesitation. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey." We stood in the living room, the silence between us heavy. Finally, Jake spoke. "I feel like I'm making things harder for you," he said, his voice filled with remorse. "Maybe I should stay away." "No," I said quickly, the word escaping before I could stop it. "I don't want you to go." "Evans." I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Jake. I'm lying to Peter, lying to myself. I feel like I'm drowning." Jake stepped closer, his expression pained. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," I whispered, my voice breaking. He reached out, brushing a tear from my cheek. "Then let's stop. We can end this, Evans. You don't have to do this to yourself." I looked up at him, my heart aching. "But what if I can't?" Before either of us could say another word, the sound of the front door opening made us both freeze. "Evans?" Peter's voice called from the hallway. Panic surged through me as I turned to Jake, my mind racing. "You have to go," I whispered urgently, pushing him toward the back door. But it was too late. Peter walked into the living room, his gaze landing on us. His expression shifted from confusion to something darker as he took in the scene, the closeness between Jake and me, the tension hanging in the air. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice sharp. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Jake stepped forward, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "Peter, it's not what it looks like," he began, but Peter cut him off. "Don't," Peter said, his voice low and dangerous. "Just don't." He turned to me, his eyes filled with betrayal. "Evans." My voice cracked, and I felt the weight of my guilt crash down on me. "Peter, I'm sorry." He stared at me, his face pale. "How long?" I couldn't answer. Peter let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. I brought him here to help you, and this is what you do." "Peter, please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for this to." "To what?" "To ruin our marriage." He snapped, his voice rising. Jake took a step back, his face etched with regret. "I should go," he said quietly. Peter glared at him. "You think?" Jake hesitated for a moment before walking out the door, leaving me alone to face the wreckage of my choices. Peter sat down on the couch, his head in his hands. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do or say. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed. "Why, Evans?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did I do wrong?" My heart broke at the pain in his voice. "You didn't do anything wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "This was my mistake, not yours." "But why?" he pressed. "I thought we were okay. I thought you loved me." "I do love you," I said, the words sounding hollow even to me. I felt lost. Like we were drifting apart. "And instead of talking to me, you turned to him," Peter said bitterly. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm so sorry, Peter. I never wanted to hurt you." He shook his head, his expression a mixture of anger and sorrow. "I don't know if I can forgive this, Evans." That night, Peter slept in the guest room. The house felt unbearably quiet, the weight of our broken relationship pressing down on me. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the empty space where he should have been, wondering if we could ever find our way back to each other. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the loss. I had shattered the life we'd built together, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. In the days that followed, Peter avoided me, his silence more painful than any words could have been. I wanted to fix things, to prove to him that I was still the woman he'd fallen in love with. But I didn't know where to start. And then one evening, he came into the living room, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. I nodded, my heart pounding. Peter sat down across from me, his gaze steady. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Evans. But I think we owe it to ourselves to try." Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. "I want to try, Peter. I'll do whatever it takes." "It's going to take time," he said. "And it's going to hurt. But I think we can get through this. If you're willing to fight for it." "I am," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll fight for us." And for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you for listening to my story, your support means a lot to me. Take good care of yourself, and thank you for subscribing. Cheers.